Chosen one, the timing of this message is not random. It's a sign that the shift has already begun. This isn't the usual video. You weren't drawn here to be entertained. You were summoned to remember what they made you forget. Right now, the setup that looked like endless warfare, betrayal, and spiritual drain is revealing its true shape. Those very attacks were the verification of your ranking, the pressure points forging your throne, and the assignments that once bound you the tunnels into your dominion. What if I told you the enemy didn't accidentally land on your path? They were assigned to test the weight of your authority, so that when you broke the contract, the throne couldn't be denied. You've been targeted not because you were weak, but because something you carried threat. Something you carried light that could no longer be contained and had to be confronted. If this message already speaks to your soul, subscribe, like this video, and comment 77 below. Stay with this until the end, because what's about to unfold will not just shift your perception. It will activate a legal reversal, throne activation, and the restoration of lineage that was waiting behind the scenes of their strategy. Number 1. Why opposition confirms your mark. They didn't attack you because you were broken. They came because you carried a prophetic code, a frequency that could not be ignored. The opposition you felt, the demon assigned to shadow your steps, the legal accusations whispered in spiritual courts. Those were not mistakes. They were public notices of your status. The enemy knows how to detect threat. He doesn't waste energy on noise. He targets embedded authority. In Zechariah 3 verse 2, when the accuser was rebuked, it revealed that the present of accusation itself was a moment of courtroom reckoning, not defeat. That's the same dynamic with your warfare. Their focus on you was the echo of your invisible ranking. They tried to define you through the noise, but the noise was actually confirmation. Think of the way a star only shines because the darkness around it contrasts its light. The fact that you've been in the crosshairs, watched, disrupted, and questioned means they sense the weight of what you carry. Comment marked if you ever felt that their pressure was proof of something deeper in you. And as you begin to see their attacks as validation instead of condemnation, the next layer opens. How the enemy got access in the first place, the hidden contracts and legal entry points that were feeding their jurisdiction. The first image that surfaces is not a battle scene with swords drawn. It's a quiet courtroom, ancient and glowing, where voices murmur and the accuser stands pointing, certain he has the evidence. Then, in the center, a light appears, not blinding, but undeniable, and the voice of the one above the noise says, "The Lord rebuke you, O Satan." That moment in Zechariah 3 verse 2 wasn't dismissal of accusation as if it didn't matter. It was a reversal of his presumed power, a public correction in a court where the enemy assumed he had jurisdiction. That same dynamic has been playing around you. They lined up their strategies, their whispers, their attempts to frame you, because they sensed something in you that could not be contained by their standard narratives. The opposition wasn't a random flare of hostility. It was a spotlight on the truth that you carry, a frequency so calibrated to destiny that darkness had to expose itself in response. The fact that you've been watched closely, pushed, questioned, shadowed, and destabilized is not proof of your weakness. It's proof that you have been seen. In the tension of their attack, a deeper validation hides. They targeted you because the threat in you was real. Remember the nights when you processed the nonstop pressure and felt like the world was against you for no reason you could name? They whispered about your edge like it was a liability, as if the very clarity you were born with made you suspect. But in reality, what they were doing was responding to the weight of your assignment. There's a strange loneliness in being under constant spiritual scrutiny. Your choice is read, your motives questioned, your silence framed as guilt, and your voice framed as rebellion. That emotional throb, that sense of being misjudged by those who should have seen you, is the echo of an invisible scale measuring significance. It's not a coincidence that the more your inner authority grew, the louder the outer noise became. Their discomfort with your authenticity, the way they tried to reshape your narrative, wasn't because you were wrong. It was because the light within you was too vivid to be left unchallenged. You have carried the weight of their projections, and as you've carried it, you began to sense the deeper signal beneath it, the real reason their eyes were locked on you. The idea that your struggle is a mistake evaporates when you shift your lens. There has always been a design behind the friction, a sacred architecture setting opposition as a gauge of your true elevation. The enemy isn't casting darts in the dark. He invests energy where he perceives influence because he knows authority, even dormant, creates ripple potential. Think of the way a concealed seed is trampled, not because it's insignificant, but because the force applied to it is preparing it to break ground with strength. Or consider the story of Joseph. The betrayal, the pit, the prison. These were not merely sufferings to crush him. They were the calibration of a position that would be undeniable in the face of the nations he would rule. The accusations, interference, and attacks you endured are not misfires. They are the measured responses of a system detecting that you carry something foundational. Even in the quiet corners, the spiritual court observed your movement and reacted, not to silence and nothing, but to attempt containment of a latent justice that would one day overturn entire legalities. Your opposition was always a mirror, and in it lies the image of your real weight. The way their strategies unfolded around you, the patterns of pressure, the attempts to destabilize your identity. Those are not signs of isolation, they are signs of selection. When you look back, you can trace the outline of their attention like a constellation. It was not random that certain people appeared as critics at precise moments when your breakthrough was near. It was not by accident that whispers increased in volume right before you found a deeper alignment, nor that confusion multiplied just before clarity collapsed the fog. Their reaction was a map of the terrain you were traversing, a reactive geometry arising from the fact that your path intersected their expected dominion. The more you grew into that invisible code, the more they try to edit your story. That editing process, which they intended as containment, became your witness. Their pushback highlighted your elevation. The darkness doesn't amplify the low-frequency noise. It amplifies the threat of a rising light. And you've been rising while the critics were busy trying to dim something that could not be turned off. There is a subtle inner shift that happens when the realization lands, not as a relief, but as a settling. That uneasy tension you carried, the defensive postures you felt compelled to adopt, begin to transform into a kind of quiet peace that has edges. You start to notice how your gut reactions were actually spiritual briefs prepared in advance for what was coming. The intuition that others dismiss as oversensitivity begins to line up with outcomes. You sense the energy of conversations before they turn. You feel the pull away from situations that would have consumed your power. And what used to trigger doubt now sends a gentle signal to adjust course. The validation isn't a loud decree. It's a gentle nod of alignment saying, "You were right. Keep listening." That inner safety grows because the source behind your seeing is more substantial than the noise around you. You are not inventing patterns to comfort yourself. You are connecting the dots of calibration that has been unfolding for years, and the long-awaited recognition of that internal guidance rewrites the question from "Am I paranoid?" to "How do I steward what I've always known?" The deeper you go, the less the need becomes something different, and the more the need to remember who you have always been. Under the layers of survival, identity, doubt, and other people's definitions, there is an original imprint, not of brokenness, but of purpose. That archetypal memory holds a code of your assignment. You were made to be perceived, to be a carrier of truth, to stand as a witness in courts where voices are quieted, and to turn opposition into protocol for elevation. This is not about adopting a new role. It is about excavating your own foundation, revealing the bedrock that was covered in dust by every narrative that tried to make you small. Like the ancient prophets who were carved out not by adding titles, but by stripping away the noise until their original voice could speak clearly. You too are peeling back what obscured your first identity. There is a gravitational pull now toward coherence. Something inside you remembers before you're articulate, and in that remembrance the old shame loses its grip, because the source of your authority is not external approval, but an origination point older than the disruptions. Now the first activation whispers. You can begin to act from what you've known, not what you've been told to wait for. That sensitivity, that inner hunger for truth, is no longer a thing to hide. It's the pilot light for your movement. Begin to choose differently. Let that receiver inform your boundaries, your associations, your voice. The life that once felt like a series of tests becomes the training ground for the authority you now step into. You don't need to prove the validity of your perception to skeptics. You begin to move in alignment with the frequency that has always been verifying itself. The activation is soft but deliberate. A decision to trust what you sense about a person, to walk away from a pattern that used to drain you. to speak when silence used to feel safer, to reclaim time you gave away because you felt unworthy. It is not dramatic. It is steady, like a river changing its course over time, and each small choice compounds into a trajectory that can no longer be interrupted by the noise of external expectation. You didn't land on this message by accident. The accumulation of what you've endured, the pressure, the questioning, and the moments of quiet seeing all funneled into this opening of clarity for a reason. Your arrival here is a checkpoint in a much larger storyline, one where what was meant to silence you becomes the evidence that confirms your place. Comment marked if you've ever felt their pressure as an unspoken acknowledgement of your weight, and add a personal reflection about a time when opposition felt like a trial but later revealed itself as a signpost. What's next is already turning. The revelation of how they were granted access, the contracts, the loopholes, the legal language that sustained the attacks. Once those are exposed, their attempt to define you collapses under the weight of your reclaimed authority. And if you feel called to go even deeper, there's a sacred space reserved for our community. A private room where you receive full prophetic messages daily. Join our private membership through the link in the description and walk this path with us. Special thanks to current members. Your presence anchors these revelations and makes this movement more than content. It makes covenant. Number 2, identifying the enemy's legal entries. You weren't randomly invaded. There were doors left open, often without your conscious permission, through which the assignment held temporary legal ground. The contract appeared as normalized trauma, generational echoes, soul ties you never willingly chose, and unrenounced rebellion that became spiritual paperwork binding the system's attention to your life. It is in the naming that the veil begins to tear. Look back and trace the threads, the family patterns where silence became inheritance, old agreements spoken in seasons of survival that were never released, emotional dependencies that operated like signed decrees giving authority to distortion, and those soul-level attachments that pleased others at the cost of your clarity. The enemy built his foothold not from random malice, but through these access points, and when you learn to read the spiritual paperwork, you see the signature of opportunity to cancel it. Isaiah 54 verse 17 isn't just a promise. It's a legal override. No weapon formed against you shall prosper when your identity is reclaimed and the authorizations are revoked. Comment exposed if you've traced one of those entry points in your story. As the contract are exposed, the stage is set for the active dismantling of what was giving the demon claim, and the next revelation will show the process of executing the judgment that nullifies their authority. The first ripple of awareness came as a quiet tightening in your chest, a moment when the weight of the opposition stopped feeling random and began to feel structured, like someone had drawn lines on a map and left them unguarded, only for those lines to become pathways into your life. You started noticing that the same types of struggles kept showing up in different forms, and the common denominator wasn't your failure. It was unexamined entry points. There were doors left open, some you thought were closed, some you didn't know existed, through which the assignment had legal standing. The thing about spiritual jurisdiction is that it doesn't always arrive with drama. Sometimes it arrives as agreements whispered in survival, bonds forged in childhood pain, unspoken loyalties to patterns that felt like family, and quiet compromises you made to get by. That subtle heaviness, the sense of being drained in certain spaces, the recurrence of the same sabotage in cycles, was the presence of access being exercised. You weren't randomly invaded. You were approached through channels that have been established over time, to the paperwork of old vows, generational imprints, and unresolved soul connections that gave those forces a foothold. It begins here. The realization that somebody had the legal right to poke, prod, accuse, and redirect, and that right came not from pure hatred but from unpaid contracts, open loops, and inherited permissions. The emotional pressure of that realization is heavy. You believed for so long that if you could just be better, more spiritual, less reactive, the attacks would stop, as if your resilience alone would void the agreement. Instead, you discover the opposite. The more you try to fix yourself without uncovering the source of breach, the more the same patterns recirculated, wearing you down into passive acceptance. That space between knowing something was off and not knowing why grew into shame. You began to question whether you were the problem, whether your sensitivity was a door, whether your story was a fault line they kept hammering. Underneath it all was a quiet manipulation that dressed itself in care, tradition, or the way things are done, making you complicit without consent. You were told to forgive and move forward, when what was needed was to dismantle the legal scaffolding that kept recreating the same traps. The spiritual exhaustion wasn't just from external blows. It was the internal battle of carrying unresolved allegiance to outdated agreements, feeling their pull while being told your instincts were wrong. That emotional landscape, filled with isolation and cyclical doubt, became fertile ground for the enemy's jurisdiction because no one taught you to read the fine print of spiritual inheritance. Slowly, a deeper perspective began to emerge. The pressure wasn't random, and the system that leaned into your resistance was reacting to something you carried, not by accident but by design. There's a sacred echo in the wilderness narratives, where separation and testing exposed identity. Moses in exile didn't just stumble into purpose. The time in the desert revealed the structures that needed dismantling before the promised land could be inhabited. Your oppression, your repeated sabotage, your shadowed patterns function similarly, not to shame, but to unmask the ways old contracts have become buried in your lineage or personal spiritual ledger. The enemy's foothold was not a spontaneous attack. It was a result of access points already in place, like doors left unlocked from previous generations' unrenounced vows, emotional dependencies that acted like signed decrees, or soul ties that weren't voluntarily entered but inherited through trauma and silence. These were the highways through which the assignment maintained legal ground, and you were reacting to structural encroachment while believing it was merely personal weakness. Understanding that this was systemic gave you distance from self-condemnation and beginning of strategic clarity. The battle was not against isolated incidents, but against a set of hidden documents and spiritual signatures that sustained the interference. Looking back became illuminating, almost like walking into a dark room and flipping the switch. The themes you once waved off as bad luck, toxic relationships, or recurring internal failure began to align on a grid you hadn't seen before. Certain family stories now read like ancestral contracts passed silently in the name of loyalty. The silence you kept under pressure now revealed itself as a forced compliance handed down from survival tactics that were never released. Betrayal showed a pattern not only of personal hurts but of spiritual handoffs. When someone hurt you and the fallout turned into a new identity, something else quietly stepped into that gap because the old wound had not been properly closed. The places you were drained repeatedly weren't failures of your energy. They were zones where the enemy's access was being reinforced by unconscious agreement. Unspoken rebellion left unaddressed, and emotional dependencies that acted like consent. Old obstacles that appeared right before breakthroughs now make sense as guardians of the same loopholes you were unknowingly maintaining. That clarity is unsettling because it reframes every why me into what's still open, but it is liberating because it gives you a traceable starting point for dismantling what has been operating in the dark. Then the resistance becomes visible, not just a vague background pressure, but a tangible interference that shows its fingerprints. The air around you sometimes thickens without explanation. Conversations derail into confusion when you try to speak truth, and the path you thought was clear is suddenly blocked by delays that feel spiritually timed. There are moments when you feel watched, not in paranoia, but with a sense that agendas are tracking your movement, adjusting their own in response to your subtle shifts. The fog that once made you doubt your senses is now recognized as distortion layered over your frequency. Old curses, inherited pain, unrenounced loyalties, and spiritual noise trying to mask your clarity. Imagine walking through a room and sensing the walls were once painted with the residue of previous authors' intentions. That's the navigation you faced. That heaviness, the sudden drop in energy when you step into certain environments, the recurring failure of attempts that should have landed because something invisible is redirecting or siphoning, are all signs that your light attracted distortion, because light interrupts the old order. It shows up as closed doors that were once open, relationships that shift inexplicably, and opportunities that wilt under pressure. Now the opposition is less a mystery and more a field of energetic signatures begging to be read and rewritten. Your internal reaction to all of this has been a survival script. Some days you shrank, some days you overperformed to prove your value, and some days you quietly rebelled by doing the opposite of what was expected, hoping the chaos would give you space. You learned to mute parts of yourself to reduce the friction, to mask your clarity, so the system wouldn't attack it, to allow others to define your narrative, so their approval would temporarily silence the pressure. There was a version of you that believed if you stayed small and agreeable, the targeting would ease. That response was not weakness. It was adaptive wisdom formed under siege. You also know the fatigue of pretending those compromises were spiritual maturity. The fear of standing out, the temptation to give up rather than keep retracing the same spiritual battles, the cyclical whiplash between wanting to leave and wanting to belong. These are data points of a deeper internal mirror. Each retreat, each people-pleasing concession, and each silent rebel moment was a partial surrender of your voice, but also a preservation of your core, waiting for a moment when you could reclaim it with clarity, not reaction. You were not broken by the pressure. You were being conditioned to recognize its source and then flip its meaning. Now comes the first bend in the story. What looked like suppression is actually confirmation. The fact that they aligned against you, that structures moved to contain your rise, is proof that you were positioned to shift something significant. The resistance wasn't a verdict. It was a marker of potential. When the enemy fought to keep you small, they revealed the scale of your influence. The narrative they wanted to script for you collapsed under the weight of their own overreaction. You are being given back your voice, not as a fragile thing that needs defending, but a rightful authority that was always yours. Stand with the truth that the very strategies meant to derail you now serve as evidence of your ranking and contribution. The reclamation starts with one statement. You will no longer allow the old contracts to define your capacity. Whatever was inherited, whatever was agreed out of survival, whatever was kept silent out of fear will be named, confronted, and unmoored from your identity. This is fierce, and it's not retaliation, it's restoration. What was taken under duress is being returned under decree, and the clarity of that transfer sharpens your purpose. You were opposed because the system recognized your real weight. The more they tried to silence, redirect, confuse, or shame you, the more obvious your trajectory became. Not to those who sought to stop you, but to the spiritual current aligning behind you. Their interference illuminated your line of sight. Comment exposed if you've traced one of those entry points in your story and are ready to break the legal hold. Add a reflection about the moment you stopped blaming yourself and began to see the architecture of access instead. The next phase is no longer identification. It is execution, the dismantling of the contracts, the renouncement of the authorizations, and prophetic declaration that voids their claim. That is where the real undoing begins. And what they built to keep you bound becomes the very evidence that collapses under your reclaimed authority. And to every soul who supported with a super thanks, thank you. You are keeping this light alive for others who haven't found it yet. If you feel called to help this mission reach more chosen ones, tap the super thanks button below. Your energy supports these messages and helps them travel further. Your voice matters, and your light is felt here. Number 3, killing the demon and voiding its claim. The moment you step into the confrontation is the moment the contract loses its power. This isn't about dramatic warfare for spectacle. It's about spiritual judgment executed with precision, authority, and alignment. You speak the truth of your identity. You name the assignment. You declare its nullification, and then you enforce it by the authority that has always been in you. The same divine energy that raised the dead, shut the mouths of lions, and turned captivity into throne room preparation. In Jonah 2 verse 2, the cry from the depths became the pivot that summoned rescue already scripted. Your declaration is a spiritual equivalent of that cry. The enemy's legal language unravels when you do 3 things. You identify the contract, you renounce the entry points that granted access, and you declare the new reality with obedience to your assignment, not driven by fear, but by prophetic clarity. The signs of this reversal are unmistakable. Cycles that once replayed now break. Recurring dreams shift from confusion to clarity. Spiritual warfare decreases not because the enemy left, but because his claim was voided. Comment liberated if you felt the fog lift after confronting a legal stronghold, and share a moment when the breakthrough felt tangible. The path ahead is already aligning. Beyond this dismantling, there is a rising activation of your dominion. The moment something inside you shifted, it wasn't a trumpet blast. It was a soft clearing of fog in the mind, like a horizon that had always been there suddenly revealing its shape. What looked previously like vague spiritual battles, random setbacks, and recurring cycles of attack now took on a new angle. This was not chaos. It was a courtroom, and you had been walking into hearings you didn't know you were in. The veil lifted enough to see that the opposition around you had structure, language, and a legal rhythm. That sudden internal clarity, recognizing that the demon, the blockage, the pattern of warfare was not merely a symptom but a claim with signatures, changed everything. You stopped wondering if you were cursed or broken, and instead began to sense that a contract had been in effect, one that gave the enemy temporary jurisdiction until something or someone stepped into their rightful authority. In that shift, the battlefield became a judgment scene, and your voice, once tentative, found the words to name the assignment. You understood that speaking it was a rebellion. It was the first act of undoing the script written against you. Beneath that dawning awareness, the pressure of long-held confusion and the emotional weight of repeated attacks began to land with more clarity. You felt the strain of carrying the same cycles, the exhaustion of fighting battles that circle without end, and the inner conflict between surrender and resistance. Those moments when you bent under spiritual weight, convinced that you'd failed the test, began to feel different, like you had been resisting the wrong thing. The emotional fatigue was not from lack of faith or weakness. It was from fighting under someone else's courtroom language while your own legal identity sat unspoken, unclaimed, and unactivated. Shame whispered that you had allowed these things to persist, but now you saw the deeper pattern. The enemy used your silence, your unclaimed authority, your unrenounced ties, and the gaps in your story as leverage to maintain access. That realization brought both a painful recognition and a tether of empowerment. Pain because you were carrying legal permissions you never gave, and empowerment because naming them started dissolving their grip. The loneliness you felt wasn't a sign that you were off track. It was a quiet echo of a system pushing against a truth that was just beginning to speak. There is a likeness here to the ancient wilderness journeys, where separation exposed a hidden contract of identity and prepared the one call for confrontation. Just as Israel wandered, encountering invisible boundary lines written in generational patterns and untested obedience, your pressure came from structures reacting to your emerging alignment. The resistance wasn't random. It was a system attempting to maintain its order in the face of your coming disruption. The assignment had legal entrances, wounds normalized into identity, oaths spoken in desperation that became spiritual paperwork, soul-level enmeshments that gave unearned access, and rebellion left unnamed that stayed as a backdoor. Those footholds allowed the assault to feel persistent, because they were being reinforced by old energies that operated in the background like unpaid ledgers in a divine economy. The sacredness of this exposure is in the unmasking. What seemed like defeat was actually a clearing of space, a removal of false authority so that the original identity could resurface and take its place at the bench. The battle wasn't to remove the enemy by force alone. It was to uncover the hidden legal frame that let him stand in judgment. Looking back now, you see the pattern like a constellation. Each betrayal, each delay, each internal confusion was connected by the same thread of access being exploited. The times you were blocked just before breakthrough reflect the same mechanism that kept you small under the guise of spiritual discipline or waiting on timing. The chaos around you was not always chaos. It was tactical noise designed to distract from the process of confronting the legal claim itself. The people who encourage you to stay quiet, the systems that reinforce your smallness, and the spiritual battles that repeated in similar form were not coincidences. They were the enemy's attempt to keep the contract in place by making you doubt whether you even had the authority to speak against it. That light bulb moment, when you finally saw the recurring sabotage not as a personal failure, but as the enemy defending a legal foothold, gave you a lens that rewired your understanding of the past. That clarity allowed you to stop seeking external validation for every move and instead begin to align with internal authority that had been dormant because it had not yet been declared. The pattern revealed itself not to condemn you, but to give you a map of what needed dismantling and what was already yours to reclaim. The interference you felt became a visible spiritual weather system. You can now name the fog, the heavy air, the sudden dips in energy around certain relationships or environments as distortions attempting to cloud the execution of judgment. There were times when your progress felt throttled by something unseen, like a tension running beneath the surface of your purpose, And you now understand that wasn't random resistance. It was the rippling aftershock of a legal claim being challenged, reacting to your rising frequency. Silent watchers, whether internalized voices or external projections, adjusted when you stepped into clarity. And the very field around you shifted in response to the authority spoken. The broken cycles, the recurring warfare, the voices trying to redefine your identity. They were all indicative that the enemy's claims still existed and tried to maintain presence through distortion, not always manifesting through overt demonic displays, but through subtle fogs that sapped your momentum. When the legal ground begins to shift, those old signatures fight to hold their space. What you're seeing now is exposure to their strategies, and that exposure gives you a new level of early detection. No longer surprised, but prepared. In the midst of that exposure, your inner survival strategies surfaced. Perhaps you folded to avoid escalation, justified inaction with spiritual terms, or played small while privately resenting the pacing. You may have tried to be agreeable to ease attention, or become defensive to shield the unspoken truth, or replace your voice with passive compliance until the system mistook your silence for acceptance. Those reactions were not failings, but adaptive responses to an environment where authority had been hijacked by unaddressed contracts. The fear of being seen was born out of being targeted when you first began to rise. The desire to shrink came from watching what speaking truth caused in relationships and status. Yet, beneath all that, a spark remained, a quiet inner remnant of identity that knew the opposition wasn't the final word. Recognizing these reactions without self-condemnation allowed you to separate the old survival narrative from the new prophetic authority. That separation is a hinge between staying in the cycle and stepping into reclamation. It turns your past coping into the foundation of your new governance. Now the energy shifts from defense to declaration. The opposition you once feared becomes the evidence that your trajectory matters. The fact that they pressed, delayed, questioned, and tried to redefine your unfoldment is the proof that the system saw your rise as a threat. Not because you were flawed, but because you were appointed. You begin to speak what was already true. The contract are revealed, the entry points are named, and the legal authority that sustained the enemy's access is being canceled. This sounds like a moment of authority returning, not taken, but remembered. There's a fierce clarity in that hand back of voice. The reclamation is not a slow recovery, but a prophetic recollection. You are no longer asking for permission to reclaim what was always yours. Your naming of the claim, your announcement of the agreements, and your declaration of the new legal status serve as the execution of spiritual judgment. That which was meant to hold you in cycles is now the very proof of your ranking, because the enemy's overexposure and pushing back shows the significance of what you carry. The resistance no longer defines you. It confirms you. You were opposed because you are powerful. The recognition of how they tried to block, confuse, and delay you wasn't a misfire of their system. It was their reflex to silence what had already been marked. Your clarity, your rise, your refusal to stay in their expected narrative made you a focal point, and their pressure pulled the outline of your purpose into sharper view. Comment liberated if you felt the fog lift after confronting a legal stronghold and can now name the weaponized access points that were holding you back. Add a personal reflection about the moment when the shift from confusion to sovereignty happened, when you stopped reacting and began declaring. The next section isn't about identification anymore. It's about execution, how to dismantle those contracts with the strategic precision of a spiritual courtroom, and how the broken claim converts into your activated dominion. Number 4, from delivered to dominion. All the dismantling, all the breaking, now feeds into elevation. Killing the demon isn't merely relief. It is a coronation. The historical weight that once bound your family line begins to shift. Generational patterns of struggle give way to new rhythms of influence. Your authority expands not because you claim it, but because it responds to the vacuum left by the vanishing assignment. The throne that was always written for you now has the sound of your footsteps on its steps. What was once recurring warfare becomes a quiet territory marked by peace, clarity, and spiritual influence that others feel in their own bones. The transformation shares the same tone as the moment when the accuser is silenced in the divine courtroom. What was once legal claim is now void, and your presence holds the evidence. Comment evidence if your healing became the unspoken proof that the enemy's hold was broken, and share a personal reflection about the first time you noticed a shift, when your peace spoke louder than any accusation. They expected you to remain trapped. Instead, you became the active ruler of the space they tried to own, and the next phase is the unveiling of how that throne doesn't just elevate you, it rewrites your lineage's destiny. The moment a decision arrives like a still point in a storm you've been surviving for years. It isn't a flashy awakening. It's a quiet, audacious question echoing in your bones. Do I keep carrying what was meant to limit me, or do I step fully into what was always written for me? That threshold is sacred, because up to now your journey has been shaped by reaction, recovery, and resistance. Now the moment demands choice. The voice inside, which used to whisper in doubt, now speaks with gravity. No more waiting, no more apologizing, no more explaining. You see the path before you and recognize that staying passive would be a betrayal of everything you've endured and everything you become. This is a line where the old narrative stopped, controlling the script, and you take the pen. The demonic assignment broke, the contract unraveled, and what once bound your lineage now opens a corridor. The crossroad is clear, and the direction forward is not uncertain. It is commanded. The question isn't whether you can. It's whether you will allow your life to shift from survivor to sovereign. The choice here carries weight, and choosing the throne is choosing dominion over what used to try to define you. You've given away pieces of yourself for survival. Your voice to keep peace, your time to prove worth, your energy to outwork fear, and your presence to accommodate the expectations of systems that never saw your fullness. That season was not failure. It was training ground. Now the call is to gather back what was scattered under pressure and reclaim it with declaration. Say it aloud. I retrieve the time I conceded to insecurity. I take back the voice I muted to avoid confrontation. I restore the presence I diluted to fit into roles that betrayed my purpose. This language is ceremony. The royalty in you doesn't beg for restoration. It announces it. What was given in awkwardness, shame, or survival is now returned in authority. The throne is not something you climb to. It is something you sit in because your identity belonged there long before the opposition tried to write a different story. The energy of your reclamation is sharp and righteous. It cuts through the residues of confusion and fills the vacuum with the rightful weight of your name. The season of being walked over ends because you've chosen to stand in your own narrative. Now start naming what lives in you without shame or softening. You carry insight that reads the undercurrent, while others argue the surface. Your sensitivity is not a weakness. It is a tuning fork for truth, the frequency that detects distortion before it masquerades as progress. Memory, both ancestral and soul level, feeds discernment, giving context to every seeming coincidence and transforming it into guidance. You hold keys and codes that unlock the next move, scrolls written in the ink of suffering that now decrypt the patterns of elevation. Your strength is not blunt force. It is quiet mastery shaped by refinement, like forged steel held in the fire then cooled with intention. This armor you wear is spiritual, layered with the past battles you survived that now protect what you carry forward. The fire inside you does not burn indiscriminately. It lights the way and exposes what hides in shadow. Recognize these gifts as tools of dominion. They are not abstract virtues to chase, but functional assets in the mission that waits ahead. You are not carrying potential. You are carrying presence. The path under your feet was never lost. It was simply waiting for your feet to decide to move with authority. Now action becomes the evidence of alignment. Each step you take clarifies a map that seemed hidden before. Momentum reveals direction. What used to feel like stumbling now feels like deliberate placements of your purpose in real time. Doors that stayed closed when you were uncertain begin to open as you move. Not because the world finally agreed with you, but because your clarity forces architecture to respond. There is a cinematic rhythm to this. You leave behind the hesitations, retrace the older traumas with a new gait, and watch previously tangled threads untie themselves because your motion refuses the paralysis that once held you. The mission isn't a distant dream to chase. It's the unfolding of the story under your feet. The field rises to meet your walk, and the ground responds because you're no longer asking if you belong. You are walking as if you've always been appointed. The forgotten assignment whispers back its own name, and the path composes itself beneath the weight of your decision. There are others moving in similar frequency, souls who have felt the same pressure, the same unraveling of old narratives, the same call from within to stop dimming and step fully into what's true. You are not a solitary anomaly. You are part of a rising order, a constellation of chosen ones whose combined light reframes the cultural darkness that try to normalize smallness. The tribes forming are not about sameness, but resonance. When you stop softening your edges to fit spaces that were never meant to hold your full brightness, you give permission to others to do the same. Your elevated presence becomes a reference point, a template for those still questioning their worth. The solidarity isn't surface-level support, it's spiritual alignment, divine clusters of influence that begin to link, echoing the unseen networks that have always held the movement together. Stop bending to dissolve systems that require sacrifice of your essence. Instead, align with those who carry the same evidence, and watch how the collective rise amplifies the individual throne. What you do matters beyond your story. It becomes the invitation for others to reclaim their place in the chain of dominion. Take command of your energy like a steward of sacred territory. The power you've been given isn't for reckless display. It's for disciplined governance. Boundaries are not walls of exclusion. They're the perimeter of your influence, the lines that protect what you're building while allowing light to flow in and through in the right measure. Choices now are informed by the inner sovereignty you reclaimed, not by reactionary fear or old survival habits. Devotion is not performing for approval, but aligning daily with the current that has been guiding you, keeping the signal clean, the frequency sharp, and the presence unmistakable. You've been entrusted with a narrative that shifts not only your life, but the lineage behind you. Act like the custodian of that trust. This is a ceremony of stewardship. Your energy is a temple, your intention is the altar, and your discipline is the offering. Hold it sacred. Let nothing cheapen the transmission. Your command is quiet, precise, unshakable. You don't ask permission to rule. You steward what was already given. Everything that has held you back, bruised you, made you question, and pushed you to the edge and prepared you for this moment. There is no need to hesitate. The internal echoes of doubt, the fear of exposure, the quiet replay of past betrayals, all of it has converged to forge a clarity so sharp that resistance now serves only to highlight your ascent. You are ready. That is not rhetoric. It is prophecy overheard in the silence before stepping through. The voice inside is no longer asking if, but when and how, because the readiness isn't hypothetical, it's actual. There is a fullness to your preparation that makes the waiting obsolete. You stand on the precipice not of becoming, but of embodying. The final breath before the portal is a declaration. The throne doesn't need validation from old systems. Your peace and presence validate it. You are not coming to claim something that was withheld. You are stepping into what has always been yours, fully aligned, fully awakened. This is a hinge where revelation turns into rule. You've been delivered from what once bound you, and now dominion is no longer a possibility. It is a necessary expression of what you've been given to steward. Comment dominion if you see the shift from surviving assignment to ruling from authority, and add a personal reflection about a moment when you first felt the weight of your readiness move from thought to action. Share a dream, a breakthrough, a quiet internal confirmation that reshaped your trajectory. Let your testimonies settle in others who are on the edge of their own crossing. The summons isn't over. The next layer will show how your activated throne begins to rewrite not just your story, but the story of those who follow in your wake, revealing how elevation radiates backward into lineage and forward into legacy. Subscribe if you haven't yet, like this video, and comment, "I am chosen to let this message anchor in your soul." This message may not stay online forever. Download your copy and transcript in the vault. Ideal for journaling, inner rituals, and sacred study. The link is in the description below. Please share it with someone who needs to hear this. Thank you to all supporting members. Your commitment amplifies the light and keeps the truth traveling. 4 full prophetic revelations daily. Join the membership via the link in the description. Your spiritual path deserves more than fragments. Step into the full light. And if this message moved you deeply, consider tapping the super thanks button to support the mission. Every super thanks fuels the light we're spreading together. Stand in evidence. Rule from peace. The throne is yours.